February 19th, 1947, a Navy aircraft lifts off from a base in the Antarctic. It's full fuel tanks. The mission's a routine flight north. At least that's how it starts. At 9:10 a.m., the pilot notices something strange. The ice below shows a yellowish discoloration. It's running in a linear pattern. He circles twice to examine it, and then he radios base camp. Then both his compasses start to spin. The magnetic compass, the gyroscope, then the controls go sluggish. About 9:15, mountains appear on the horizon. Mountains he's never seen before. And by 10 a.m., he's crossing over them. On the other side is a valley. It's lush, it's green, with a river running through it. This is the South Pole. He should be over ice and snow. But the external temperature reads 74 degrees Fahrenheit, so he drops to 1,400 feet. He executes a sharp turn and he spots what looks like a large animal, an elephant, a mammoth. He drops to 1,000 feet, grabs his binoculars, and confirms it. It's a mammoth. He tries to radio base camp, but the radio's dead. By 11:30 a.m., he sees a city. Then, off his port and starboard wings, disc-shaped craft. They're closing fast, and they have markings on them, a type of swastika. The controls won't respond, the plane's engines stop, and a voice comes over the radio in English with what he describes as a slight Nordic or Germanic accent. It says, "Welcome, Admiral. We'll land you in exactly 7 minutes. Relax, you're in good hands." The aircraft starts to descend on its own like some kind of giant invisible elevator. They touch down with barely a jolt, and tall men with blonde hair approach the aircraft. He's taken before a figure they call the Master. And the Master delivers a message. He says his people have been flying their machines, he calls them Flügelrods, to the surface world after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Says they've never interfered in humanity's wars before, but now they must, because we learned to harness the power of the atom. He tells the Admiral that there's a great storm gathering in our world, a black fury that won't spend itself for many years. Says there will be no answer in your arms, there will be no safety in your science. Says World War II was only a prelude, and he gives the Admiral a mission: return to the surface world with a message. March 11th, 1947, he attends a staff meeting at the Pentagon, reports his discovery, and delivers the message from the Master. It's all duly recorded. The President is advised, the Admiral is detained for 6 hours and 39 minutes. He was interviewed by top security forces and a medical team, and then he's ordered to remain silent on behalf of humanity. Now, that's what the document says. It's called The Secret Lost Diary of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. We did a whole video on it. Check it out if you get a chance. It's one of the most contested documents in this space. I mean, there's no chain of custody, no way to verify it, and to be honest, it reads more like science fiction than a legitimate military flight log. But whether or not you believe a single word of that diary, some things are a matter of public record. The man who authorized that Antarctic expedition, the man who built the CIA, the NSA, the National Security Council, the man who would have received any briefing that came out of that mission, now that man was the most powerful person in American national security. And 2 years after Admiral Byrd came back from the South Pole, he was dead. Bathrobe sash knotted around his neck, broken glass on the bed, fell or pushed from the 16th floor hospital window. The official investigation didn't call it a suicide, they just classified the report and walked away for 55 years. His name was James Forrestal. His story and the circumstances of his death are fascinating and curious. I'm John Genoa, and you're watching America's Strangest History. This is the fall of Forrestal. Stay with me. So, who was James Forrestal? Well, before he was the most powerful man in American national security, he was a Wall Street guy. Born 1892 in Matawan, New York, worked his way through Dartmouth and Princeton, didn't actually get his degree from Princeton. He dropped out 6 weeks before graduation. It didn't matter, because James Forrestal had something most Ivy Leaguers didn't: serious drive and ambition. He ends up at Dillon Read & Company, one of the biggest investment banks in New York. And by the time he's 46 years old, he's the president of the firm. It's a Wall Street titan. Then World War II happens. Roosevelt taps him for government service in 1940. He starts as an administrative assistant to the president, which sounds like a desk job, but it's not. By 1944, he's Secretary of the Navy, and in that role, he oversees the entire procurement operation for the entire Pacific Theater. We're talking ships, planes, weapons, supplies, the industrial machine that won the war against Japan. That's his operation. He's also the guy who pushed for a psychological warfare plan to end the war with Japan early, without dropping a bomb and without the Soviet intervention. Japan had been sending out peace feelers since the winter of '44. Forrestal's plan had a real shot, but it ultimately got rejected. Hiroshima and Nagasaki happened instead. And Forrestal spent the rest of his career asking questions about why his plan was passed over. Dangerous questions. But here's where it gets really interesting. After the war, the United States government decides it needs to reorganize the entire national security apparatus. The Army and Navy need to be unified under one department. Intelligence needs to be centralized. And somebody needs to build the architecture for it all. And that somebody turns out to be James Forrestal. The National Security Act of 1947. This is the single most important piece of legislation in the history of American intelligence. It creates the CIA. It creates the National Security Council. It establishes the position of Secretary of Defense, unifying the Army, the Navy, the Air Force under one civilian leader. And the first person to hold the job? James Forrestal. So think about what that means. This is the man who built the machine. The CIA reports through a structure that he designed. The National Security Council, that's his creation. Every classified briefing, every covert operation, every intelligence assessment that flows through the United States government, well, it runs through architecture that James Forrestal put in place. So there's no one in Washington who holds more secrets than this man. And that's a problem, because Forrestal has enemies. The biggest one is a newspaper columnist named Drew Pearson. Pearson writes a syndicated column called Washington Merry-Go-Round. It runs in hundreds of papers across the country. And Pearson hates Forrestal. He runs column after column attacking him, questioning his loyalty, his competence, his mental fitness. Walter Winchell piles on too on the radio. Between the two of them, they reach tens of millions of Americans every week. Now, why does Drew Pearson have it out for the Secretary of Defense? Well, there's a couple of reasons, but the big one is Palestine. In 1947 and 48, the question of what to do with Palestine is tearing Washington apart. The Truman administration is moving towards supporting the creation of a Jewish state. Forrestal thinks that's a mistake. It's not because he's anti-Jewish. It's because he's looking at it from a different angle, from a national security perspective. He argues that alienating the entire Arab and Muslim world, it's 450 million people, is going to damage American strategic interests for generations. He wants an even-handed policy, and he says so out loud. Not good. Bernard Baruch, one of the most powerful men in America, privately warns Forrestal at a luncheon in February 1948 not to be active on this particular issue. He says he's already identified with opposition to U.S. policy on Palestine to a degree that's not in his own best interest. But Forrestal doesn't listen, and the campaign against him intensifies. Pearson's columns get nastier. The whisper campaign starts. Forrestal's unstable. Forrestal's paranoid. Forrestal's having a breakdown. Meanwhile, Harry Truman's watching all of this. And Truman has his own reasons to want Forrestal gone. Forrestal had quietly hedged his bets during the 48 election. He reached out to Thomas Dewey's people in case Truman lost. Well, Truman found out, and presidents don't forget things like that. So by 1949, Forrestal's isolated. His political allies are peeling away. The press is savaging him. And the President of the United States wants him out. March 1st, 1949, Forrestal's told to submit his resignation. The way it happens feels like a dismissal under fire. He'd been half prepared to step down, but not like this, not abruptly, and with the entire Washington press corps watching him walk out the door while Drew Pearson takes a victory lap. March 28th, 1949, a ceremony at the Pentagon. Forrestal watches his successor, Louis Johnson, get sworn in as Secretary of Defense. Then he drives to the White House. And there, to his complete surprise, a second ceremony. The cabinet, the military chiefs, senior officials, they're all waiting. Truman himself pins a Distinguished Service Medal on Forrestal's civilian coat and reads a citation for meritorious and distinguished service. Forrestal tries to respond, "It's beyond my," and he can't finish. Truman says, "There you are. You deserve it, Jim." The most powerful man in national security, and he can't find the words. Now, the next morning, he attends a special meeting of the House Armed Service Committee. It's called specifically to honor him. Both the chairman and the ranking minority members eulogize him. He replies briefly and gracefully. Then he boards a plane, destination Florida. He's a guest of his old friend Robert Lovett. The idea is rest and recovery. Get away from Washington for a while. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. Within days, Forrestal's condition deteriorates sharply. The man who built the CIA, the NSA, the National Security Council, the man who held more secrets than anyone in all of Washington, well, he's about to disappear behind the walls of a Navy hospital, and almost nobody's going to be allowed to see him. So let's go back to 1945. The war just ended, and while the rest of the country's celebrating, Admiral Richard E. Byrd is writing memos. He's in Tokyo 8 days after Japan's formal surrender, and he's drafting papers about Antarctica. His arguments were pretty straightforward. Antarctica is about the size of the United States and Mexico combined. So no comparably sized landmass on Earth is devoid of valuable natural resources. So geological surveys have already been done and they found trace minerals. Fuel and energy sources are abundant. And here's the thing, Hitler's U-boats, they were cruising near the Arctic Circle during the war. Armed German merchant cruisers preyed on Allied whaling vessels down there. The British already sent a secret expedition in 1943, Operation Tabarin. It's to contest Argentina's claims to the peninsula. Byrd's warning is this: unless Washington keeps a very close eye on the South Polar regions, we may someday be surprised by a coup from an unbelievable direction. His recommendation? A full-scale reconnaissance of Antarctica using aircraft carriers, long-range planes, anything they can do to map the entire continent. He says it has to be done now while we're still trained and they have the manpower and the equipment following the war. The Navy loves this idea, and not just because of the reasons Byrd's pitching. See, the Army Air Corps is pushing hard for an independent Air Force. They're calling the Navy obsolete. The Navy needs a big show, a massive military operation to prove that it's still relevant in this post-war world. December to March is summer in Antarctica. A huge expedition down there would demonstrate cold weather capability and make headlines at the same time. So in August 1946, Vice Chief of Naval Operation D.C. Ramsey issues orders to commanders of the Atlantic and the Pacific fleets. The Antarctic Development Project is officially set in motion. Unofficially, it's called Operation Highjump, and the scale of the thing is staggering. A dozen warships, including an aircraft carrier and a submarine, twice as many aircraft, 3 task groups, 4,700 men. Their mission? Map as much of Antarctica as possible in 6 to 7 weeks of flying. And the man in command? Admiral Richard E. Byrd. Now, who authorized the expedition? Who's the Secretary of the Navy when Byrd was writing those memos and lobbying to the brass? James Forrestal, the man who would become the first Secretary of Defense months later. Remember that. So Highjump launches in 1946, and on the evening of January 29, 1947, Byrd leads 6 transport planes off the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Philippine Sea. Jet-assisted takeoff bottles strapped to each wing, the aerial mapping campaign proceeds. The Navy films everything, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer produces a feature film documentary called The Secret Land. It wins an Academy Award. Now, the popular version of the story, the one that circulates online, it says that Highjump was supposed to last 6 to 8 months and was mysteriously cut short after just 8 weeks. Now, that's not exactly what the record shows. The expedition biographer Lyle Rose describes it as proceeding along as scheduled and relatively successfully close. The flying window was always planned for around 6 to 7 weeks because that's all the austral summer will allow. So the timeline itself isn't really a mystery. The mystery is what happened after, because this is where the El Mercurio interview enters the picture. In March 1947, Byrd reportedly sits down with a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio. He says something extraordinary. He warns that the United States should prepare for the possibility that hostile aircraft capable from flying pole to pole at tremendous speeds is real. Now, I'll be honest with you, the interview was widely circulated in this space, but the original Spanish language source has never been independently verified to modern archival standards. Now, multiple English translations circulate online with slight variations, so we're presenting it as what Byrd is reported to have said, not necessarily a confirmed transcript. But here's what is confirmed. A planned follow-up expedition, Highjump 2, was in advanced stages of planning by the summer of 1949. Ships, men, planes, equipment, they're all earmarked, but it never happened. Truman killed it. He liked the Navy documentary that won the Academy Award. Remember, it's called The Secret Land. It's a curious title. So what did Byrd report when he got back to Washington? What did he tell Forrestal? Well, we don't have that briefing. If it exists, it's never been released. But we do know this much. The man who sent Byrd to Antarctica, the man who would have received whatever Byrd brought back, well, he was already in the crosshairs. And his situation was about to get a lot worse. So Forrestal lands in Hope Sound on March 29, 1949. He's a guest of Robert Lovett, and within a day or two, it's clear it's not exhaustion. The man who'd been running the entire Defense Department, running the cabinet meetings, managing inter-service rivalries, briefing the president, well, he could barely function. A Navy psychiatrist, Captain George N. Rains, he arrives the evening of March 31st. He doesn't interview the patient right away because another specialist is already en route. Ferdinand Eberstad, one of Forrestal's closest friends, is bringing in Dr. William Menninger, like the Menninger Clinic Menninger, one of the most respected psychiatrists in the country. Menninger examines Forrestal, and the determination is immediate hospitalization. Now here's where the decisions really start to show significance, because there's really no choice to be made here. The Menninger Clinic in Kansas is equipped for exactly this kind of patient. It's staffed, secure, it's designed for treatment. That's where Forrestal should go. But that's not what happens. The decision made by Forrestal's wife Josephine with White House reinforcement is to send him to Bethesda Naval Hospital. It's a naval facility in Washington where the government can keep an eye on him. April 2nd, 1949, Forrestal's flown back from Florida and admitted to Bethesda Naval Hospital that evening. They put him on the 16th floor, the VIP suite. Now, think about that for a second. This is a man who's been diagnosed with severe depression, a man whose own psychiatrist will later describe this period as the most dangerous period of illness as far as suicide was concerned. And they put him on the 16th floor, not in a one-story psychiatric building that's actually staffed and equipped to deal with situations like this. Nope. The 16th floor of the central tower with windows. The American Psychiatric Association will later point out that the Navy's decision reflects an institutional hostility to psychiatry. It's a belief that mental illness is a disgrace, especially when the patient is a very important person. Translation? They treated it like it was a PR problem, not a medical care problem. So Forrestal's on the 16th floor and the isolation begins. His brother Henry tries several times to visit. He's refused by both Dr. Raines and the hospital's acting commanding officer, Captain Hogan. Henry finally gets in, but only after he threatens to go to the newspapers and he take legal action against the hospital. And when he does get in, he finds James, quote, acting and talking as sanely and intelligently as any man I've ever known. His words. Meanwhile, Forrestal sent for his old friend Monsignor Shee of Catholic University. Forrestal was a lapsed Catholic, and on being put in the hospital, perhaps with the sense of what was coming, he wanted to see a priest. 5 times Monsignor Shee tried to visit. 5 times he was refused admittance. 5 times. Father Shee later said, had I been allowed to see my friend Jim Forrestal, receive him back to the church, and put his mind at ease with the oldest and most reliable medicine known to mankind, he'd be alive today. So who's making the decisions? Who's deciding that Forrestal's own brother can't visit? That the priest can't see him? Dr. Raines? Captain Hogan? The Navy? And when the Wilcox report is finally released 55 years later, the board's own records show that Raines told investigators he gave Forrestal's friends nothing but the most complete cooperation. Yeah, Henry Forrestal says otherwise. The priest says otherwise. Somebody's not telling the truth. By late April, Forrestal does start to improve. By the accounts of everyone that sees him, he seems like his old self. He's having conversations, he's making plans with what he'll do after the discharge. Henry Forrestal makes train reservations to come back to Washington on May 22nd to take his brother out of the capital. He books a room at the Mayflower Hotel. He calls the hospital and tells them that he's coming to take James Forrestal home. He never gets there. Hours before Henry's train's scheduled to leave, he gets news. His brother's dead. The doctors said Forrestal was improving. The psychiatrist described him as nearing the end of his illness. Dr. Raines left town for a week during what he would later describe as the most dangerous period of the illness. He just up and left. And the window in the kitchen on that 16th floor was unguarded. March 22nd, 1949, sometime after midnight, Forrestal's in his own room on the 16th floor of Bethesda Naval Hospital. He's reading Mark Van Doren's Anthology of World Poetry, and he's copying out a poem, the chorus from Ajax, Sophocles. It's about a warrior far from home, forgotten, hopeless. Fair Selimus, the billows' roar wanders around thee yet. Sailors gaze upon thy shore, firm in the ocean's set. Thy sun is in the foreign clime where Ida feeds her countless flocks. Far from thy dear, remember rocks, worn by the waste of time. He copies line after line in longhand and stops mid-word. The word is nightingale. He writes night, just puts the pen down. The sheet gets placed in the back of the book's placed on the bed table, and it's open to that poem. Then he walks across the corridor into the small kitchen on the same floor. That window is unguarded. His bedroom window is guarded, but not the kitchen. He goes out that window and he falls 13 stories. His broken body lands on the roof of a 3rd floor passageway. A bathrobe sash is knotted around his neck. The cord is unbroken. It's not tied tight enough to prevent breathing, and his watch is still running. A few minutes before 2 a.m., a nurse on the 7th floor hears a loud crash. Now, the man who was supposed to be watching Forrestal that night was a corpsman named Robert Wayne Harrison. Harrison had been assigned to the hospital only about a week before Forrestal was admitted. Now, on May 20th, just just 2 days before the death, Harrison was put on the overnight watch for the first time. He replaced a corpsman named Southers who'd been doing that shift for over 2 weeks. So why the switch? The board never asks. They never call Southers to testify. They never ask what his normal experience is like on an overnight shift. And when the board does ask Harrison if he heard any unusual noises from the kitchen, he doesn't say no. He says, "I heard nothing. I definitely would have." Interestingly, there's a petri dish being used as an ashtray in Forrestal's bedroom. It's whole when Forrestal was last seen alive. Now, after his death, it's in shards, broken glass on the bed. The board asks Harrison about noises from the kitchen. They never ask him about noises from the bedroom. They never ask him if there were any signs of a struggle, because broken glass on the bed definitely does suggest one. A photographer testifies that he took a picture of broken glass on the rug about an hour after Forrestal's death. But when you look at the photograph in the report's exhibits, Forrestal's bedroom looks like something out of a magazine. It's spotless. Somebody cleaned up before the official photographic record was made. Who ordered that? The board doesn't ask. And then there's the poem. Dr. Raines tells the board that a handwritten copy of the Sophocles poem was found, and that the handwriting looks like Forrestal's. The board never follows up. They never call a single witness to verify who wrote it. They never introduce the poem as a formal exhibit. It just kind of shows up in the nursing record. An ancient Greek poem in a nursing record. And when the handwriting is eventually examined, it's not even Forrestal's. Somebody else wrote the poem. The board never even determines who. Now here's the thing about the bathrobe sash. We're told it was knotted around his neck, but not tight enough to prevent breathing. But think about the state of his body after a 13-story fall. No pulse, no muscle tone, massive blood loss on impact. Of course the cord would be loose by the time anyone examined it, but the board never considers this. They also never ask how long the cord was or whether there's any evidence that it was tied to something else. The most important piece of physical evidence in the case, and it gets almost no attention. Here's what the board concludes. After 5 days of testimony, they don't find suicide. Neither of the two finding of fact sections mentions the word suicide. The review of evidence states only that hospital psychologists considered Forrestal a potential suicide risk and that they took a calculated risk. Then it abruptly stops. The official conclusion is that Forrestal's death was caused by the fall and that no one in the Navy's medical corps was responsible. That's it. So, no determination of how he was caused to fall out the window. No investigation into whether someone else was involved. They just stopped, and then the report gets classified. It sits in the Navy file for 55 years. Nobody sees it. Nobody even asks about it. Until 2004, when a researcher named David Martin files a Freedom of Information Act request and pries it loose. 55 years. The official investigation into the death of the first Secretary of Defense, the man who built the CIA, the NSA, the National Security Council, they didn't call it suicide, and they didn't investigate a murder. They just walked away. So let's talk about the documents, the purported documents. December 1984, a plain envelope arrives at the home of Los Angeles movie producer Jamie Shandara. No return address, Albuquerque postmark. Inside, a roll of exposed but unprocessed 35mm film. Shandara decides to develop it, and what comes out is 8 pages of what appears to be classified briefing paper, dated November 18th, 1952, addressed to President-elect Dwight Eisenhower. Stamped top secret, magic eyes only. It describes the discovery and recovery of a crashed craft near Roswell, New Mexico in 1947. Small human-like beings found at the site, a recent operation to uncover the wreckage, and the creation of a committee to manage it all moving forward. 12 members, scientists, military leaders, intelligence officials, codenamed Majestic 12. Now attached to this briefing paper is a memo. It's dated September 24th, 1947. It's signed by President Harry Truman, and it's addressed to one person, the Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. It authorizes Forrestal to establish a board of suitably qualified persons answerable directly and only to the President to be known as Majestic 12. So Forrestal isn't just on the list, he's the man Truman tasked with creating it. He and Vannevar Bush are credited as having recommended the group's formation. So if this document is real, James Forrestal didn't just hold secrets, he held the secret the biggest one there is, and he's dead less than 2 years later. Now here's where it gets weird for longtime viewers of this channel. That roll of film didn't arrive at Shandara's door by accident. Shandara was working with somebody, a UFO researcher named Bill Moore. Moore and Shandara, together with nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, spent 2 years trying to verify that document. They received anonymous tips, mysterious postcards, phone calls. One postcard came from New Zealand with a hint about a specific box number at a national archive. Well, Moore and Shandara went looking, and in 1985 they found what's called the Cutler-Twining Memo. It's box 189. It's a document referencing Majestic 12. It was later determined that Robert Cutler, the man who supposedly wrote it, was out of the country on the date it was written. The FBI investigated the MJ-12 documents and declared them completely bogus. But the FBI saying a document is bogus doesn't tell you who made it or why, and the question of why is where Bill Moore comes in. We did a video on this guy. Check it out if you get a chance. Bill Moore is the same Bill Moore who was working with Air Force Office of Special Investigations agent Richard Doty. The same Richard Doty who ran disinformation on Paul Benowitz until the man had a psychological breakdown. The same Doty who contaminated the Cash Landrum investigation. The same Doty that spoon-fed Linda Moulton Howell misinformation to try to ruin her HBO deal. Moore admitted publicly in a 1989 MUFON conference that he'd been feeding disinformation to the UFO community on behalf of Air Force intelligence, his own words. So the document that names James Forrestal as the architect of the most secret committee in American history just happens to surface through the man who is a confirmed disinformation asset for the same intelligence apparatus that Forrestal built. Try to wrap your mind around that. Either MJ-12 is real and it's the biggest leak in American intelligence history, and it happened to be delivered through a man who just happened to be running disinformation through the Air Force, or MJ-12 is disinformation itself, and someone inside the intelligence community deliberately put Forrestal's name on a fabricated document 35 years after his suspicious death. Either way, Forrestal's name's on it. And either way, it came through Doty's network. The same network this channel has now watched operate across 3 different episodes. That's Forrestal, but what about Byrd? Byrd's name isn't on the MJ-12 documents, but Byrd doesn't need to be on the list, because the connection between Byrd and Forrestal isn't a signature on a piece of paper, it's an expedition. Forrestal authorizes Highjump. Remember that crazy story about the US military in the Antarctic in the beginning of the episode? That one? Well, Forrestal was the Secretary of the Navy when Byrd took 4,700 men to the bottom of the world. Whatever Byrd found down there, whatever he reported when he came back, Forrestal was the man who received it. And if the purported diary is to be believed, Byrd attended a staff meeting at the Pentagon in March of 1947, and he delivered a message that got him detained for 6 hours and ordered to remain silent. Now, we can't verify that diary. We can verify the man who would have been on the other end of that briefing, the man who built the machine, who would classify it. Well, he was dead 2 years later under circumstances that the Navy's own investigations refused to call suicide. And the report was locked away for 55 years. So, what's the connection? It's not the members list, it's the chain of command. Forrestal authorizes the mission, Byrd carries it out, the documents that name Forrestal surface through a disinformation agent. Every road into this story leads to a locked door, and somebody has the keys. So we talked about Forrestal, we talked about the expedition he authorized and the man he sent to lead it. We talked about the documents and the disinformation agent that delivered them. Now let's talk about what happened to the family. Admiral Richard E. Byrd dies March 11th, 1957. Heart ailment. He's 68 years old. By then, he's the most famous explorer in American history. First man credited with flying over the North Pole, 1926. Led the first American expedition to the South Pole, 1929. Operation Highjump, 1947. He went back again for Operation Deep Freeze in the mid-50s as part of the International Geophysical Year. The man spent more time on ice than any human being alive. And when he dies, he leaves behind a mountain of material. Papers, manuscripts, expedition logs, correspondences, over 50 file cabinets, 400 reels of film. Also Eskimo boots and coats worn by explorers. These are artifacts that are scattered across bank vaults, storage units, barns, basements, decades of Antarctic expeditions documented in extraordinary detail. And all of it needs a guardian, and that job falls to his son, Richard E. Byrd Jr. And Byrd Jr. wasn't a stranger to Antarctica. He joined his father in an expedition to the South Pole in the 40s. He knew the work, he knew the legacy, and after his father dies, he makes it his life's mission to protect it. His son Leverett later told the press, he idolized his father. The main focus of his life was to continue what his father started, to help people who wanted information about him. Relatives said that he dreamed of establishing a museum in Boston dedicated to the Admiral, but that the weight of the history took its toll. Byrd Jr. lived off small trust funds and stock market investments. His marriage collapsed. He moved back to Beacon Hill, his mother's house, and for 30 years he guarded those papers. Leverett said his whole life was pretty difficult. You could imagine what it was like to be the son of Admiral Byrd. Now remember the beginning of this episode? September 13th, 1988. 68-year-old Richard E. Byrd Jr. boards a train in Boston. He's headed to Washington for a cemetery at National Geographic Society headquarters. They're honoring his father with a new U.S. postage stamp. His son Leverett is put on the train. His wife's supposed to meet him at the other end. He never arrives. 3 weeks go by. His family reports him missing from Boston, and then on October 3rd, a custodian at a vacant warehouse in Baltimore finds a body. A debris-strewn building, the body's clad in workman's clothes and is missing a shoe. The custodian remembers this man. He ran him off the property a few days earlier, thought he was a drifter. Now, police identify him through a Boston Transit Authority card that was pinned to his underpants. It's Richard E. Byrd Jr. Cause of death? Malnutrition and dehydration. The son of the most famous explorer in American history starved to death in an abandoned warehouse wearing somebody else's clothes on his way to honor his father. Curious. Leverett told the press that his father suffered from some memory loss, but never wandered before. Baltimore police investigated. Investigator Charles Gilbert told a radio station that police still didn't know how Byrd ended up in that warehouse. No evidence of foul play. Toxicology results are pending, and that's pretty much where the story ends. No further investigation. No answers to the obvious questions. How does a man board a train in Boston wearing a tan shirt and brown pants and turn up dead 3 weeks later in a Baltimore warehouse wearing workman's clothes and missing a shoe? Where did the clothes come from? Who changed his clothes? How did he get to Baltimore? If he wandered off due to memory loss, how did he end up 40 miles south of Washington in an abandoned warehouse? And if somebody found him confused and disoriented on a train platform somewhere between Boston and Washington, why didn't anyone call the police? Now, these are all good questions, but nobody knows. Nobody investigated further. The papers, the film, the artifacts, they all eventually made their way to the Ohio State University's Byrd Polar Research Center. What's in them? What might be missing? Nobody's ever fully cataloged the answer. So let's lay it out. James Forrestal built the modern-day national security state. He authorized the largest Antarctic expedition in history and sent Admiral Byrd to the bottom of the world with 4,700 men. He was forced out of office by a coordinated campaign led by Pearson and Walter Winchell with help from inside of the White House. He was locked on the 16th floor of the hospital. His brother was refused visitations. His priest was turned away 5 times. And on May 22nd, 1949, he went out the kitchen window on the 16th floor of that hospital. Broken glass on the bed and a poem in somebody else's handwriting left behind. The Navy convened an investigation. It didn't conclude suicide. It didn't investigate murder. It just stopped. Admiral Byrd, the man Forrestal sent to Antarctica, died in 1957. His son spent the next 30 years guarding his father's papers across dozens of storage locations. And in September 1988, on his way to Washington to honor his father's National Geographic ceremony, he disappeared from a train and turned up dead in a Baltimore warehouse 3 weeks later. Nobody knows how he got there. Nobody investigated further. The documents that name Forrestal as the architect of the most secret committee in American intelligence history has surfaced through Bill Moore, and he's a committed disinformation asset working at the same Air Force intelligence apparatus that Forrestal created. The diary that describes what Byrd found in Antarctica has no verified chain of custody, but the man who would have received that briefing is dead under suspicious circumstances, and the investigation was classified for 55 years. Every thread in the story leads back to 2 men, Forrestal and Byrd. One built the machine, the other went where the machine sent him. We did a video on MJ-12, on Admiral Byrd's lost diary, on Cash Landrum, on what Doty did to Lyndon Moulton Howell. This is the thread that connects them all. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.